A lounge in a nursing home in the early 2000s says, the elderly man, who belatedly realized that a paint job was actually an assassination, explains how he became a hitman. In 1975, Frank Sheeran was driving to Detroit with mafia boss Russell Bufalino and their wives to attend Russell's nephew's wedding. When they stopped for the wives to smoke, a nostalgic place caught Frank's eye. The story returns to Philadelphia in the 1950s. At that time, Frank was in his 30s and worked as a meat delivery truck driver. When the truck broke down, he stopped at a nearby Texaco gas station, where he met a man named Russell who fixed the car for him. Later, he discovered that Russell was a powerful figure who owned the entire route. Later, while delivering meat, Frank wanted to earn more money. Through a friend's introduction, he decided to supply beef directly to Skinny Razor Felix DeTullio, a loan shark and the owner of the Friendly Lounge. Skinny Razor was pleased with the meat, and someday Frank crossed the line. Eventually, Frank was sued by the company. In response, attorney William E. Bufalino, a member of the powerful trucking union Teamsters, which had significant influence across the United States at the time, stepped in to defend him. Bill asked Frank if he would name the co-conspirator, and Frank said he wouldn't. In the end, thanks to Bill's defense, the judge dismissed the case with a warning to the company. The influence of the Teamsters was that strong. At a celebration for their victory, Frank encountered Russell again, who turned out to be Bill's cousin. Frank saw Russell sitting with Angelo Bruno, the Philadelphia mafia boss he had only seen in the newspapers. A short while later, Frank shared bread with Russell. Russell, who was of Italian descent, was surprised to hear Frank speaking Italian. Frank mentioned that he had fought on the Italian front during World War II in Catania, which is also Russell's hometown. In the early days of the war, Frank had prayed that if he survived, he wouldn't commit any crimes. However, by the end of the war, he was killing people without a second thought, seemingly losing part of his humanity to the brutality of war. Having won Russell's favor, Frank stepped into the world of crime. Russell's wife Carrie was also from Catania and was the daughter of a prominent mafia family. Because of this, Russell gained a sense of legitimacy as a mafia member and wielded significant influence as the boss of the Bufalino family. He disliked outside interference, so his orders had to be handled personally. Even serious matters, such as the assassination of a New York mafia boss, were resolved when Russell intervened, entering the world of crime by assisting Skinny Razor with his loan sharking. Frank one day notices his second daughter Peggy's downcast expression. She had been scolded by the store owner for spilling items. Angered, Frank took his daughter to the store to show the owner whose daughter he had touched. However, Peggy was only scared of her father's behavior. Soon after, Frank's third daughter, Dolores, was born and baptized. During this time, Peggy began to develop a resentment toward the mafia, feeling that they were influencing her father to do bad things. However, more child, more money. One day, a man named Whispers DeTullio approached him, offering a $2,000 advance on a total job of $10,000. He asked Frank to completely eliminate a Jewish laundry that was interfering with his laundry business. As Frank was preparing to carry out the bombing, Skinny Razor showed up, saying Angelo wanted to see him. It turned out that the laundry was a business run by Angelo and the Jewish mafia, which Russell had saved just before it was about to go under. When Frank tried to return the money and cancel the job, Angelo told him, "That guy doesn't need the money," and added sternly about Russell, "You don't know how good a friend you've got." Preparing a brand new gun, Frank called Whispers to him and made sure he would never need money again. He immediately disposed of the weapon in the Schuylkill River. If all the guns discarded there were collected, they could probably arm an entire state. After that incident, Frank returned to a military-like routine, receiving orders, killing people, and collecting his rewards. He was officially beginning his activities as a paint job, or hitman, for the mafia. At the time, Frank had built a strong bond of trust with Russell. He fell in love at first sight with Irene, who was working as a waitress. He eventually left his wife and remarried Irene. Fortunately, Irene got along well, not only with Frank's children, but also with Russell and his wife. Russell, who had no children of his own, took good care of Frank's daughters, but he noticed that Peggy, in particular, was afraid of both him and her father. Meanwhile, Russell introduced Frank to Jimmy Hoffa, the president of the Teamsters Union, which had close ties with the mafia, saying that Jimmy needed his help. With over 1.7 million union members under his control, Jimmy dominated U.S. logistics and was one of the most powerful figures in the U.S. at the time. Facing opposition from large corporations and the government who wanted to dissolve the union, Jimmy decided to work with Frank, the painter and also carpenter, to protect his power. Heading to Chicago, Frank meets Joe Glimko, the regional chairman and a member of the Chicago Mafia. At the time, the Teamsters were trying to recruit taxi drivers into the union, but the drivers were joining the Seafarers Union instead. In response, Joe, claiming that both the police and the mayor were under Jimmy's control, was retaliating by sinking the taxis into the river. Exhausted, Frank chooses an easier method. Boom! After a satisfying explosion, Joe tells Frank that Jimmy values time greatly, doesn't drink alcohol, and prevents others from drinking as well. He also shares that Jimmy hates watermelon, so Joe sticks a liquor bottle into a watermelon for drink. Joe praises Frank's simple and effective solution, and Jimmy begins to appreciate Frank, despite his somewhat aggressive methods, for resolving problems quickly. Thus, Frank stays in Chicago, handling Jimmy's troublesome tasks. As time passed, Jimmy grew closer to Frank's family. Though he loved children, his own were grown and independent, so he became particularly fond of Frank's daughters, especially Peggy. Unaware of his true nature, Peggy believed that Jimmy was not like Russell or Frank, who crushed others as part of the mafia, but rather a great man working hard for the union members. She admired Jimmy and was proud of him. Jimmy managed the $8 billion union pension fund with precision. He would often give Russell a commission for introducing businessmen in need of loans. At the time, gambling money couldn't go through banks, so Jimmy also lent funds for the construction of Las Vegas. When granting loans, they involved an insurance company, and the paperwork was handled by a man named Alan Dorfman. FYI, $8 billion from the 1970s to $65 billion in 2024. Sam Momo Giancana, who was one of Jimmy's clients, had a close relationship with the Irish Kennedy family and greatly helped Joe Kennedy's son, John F. Kennedy, during his presidential campaign. He manipulated the votes in Illinois using the identities of deceased people to secure JFK's victory. In return, JFK promised to drive Castro out of Cuba and restore everything the mafia had owned there. So while the mafia was pleased with JFK's election, Jimmy, who despised rich boys and had supported Nixon, the opposing candidate felt a growing sense of danger. As he feared when JFK's brother Robert Kennedy became Attorney General, he made every effort to send Jimmy to prison for using union funds to support Nixon. But he didn't stop there. He also began attacking the mafia that had backed JFK. Under the Attorney General's attacks, Jimmy was on the verge of losing his mind, unable to properly run the union. When Frank asked Russell why that happened, Russell explained the business rights in Cuba and then asked Frank to go to Milestone Hauling. The place they arrived at in the truck was a military base. Yes, it was where weapons were being secretly supplied for the Bay of Pigs invasion. However, the Bay of Pigs invasion turned into a massive failure, and while Bill tried to calm Jimmy, who was worried about the fallout, but their friend from the mafia, Joe Kennedy, was dying from a stroke. As the situation grew more difficult, Jimmy appointed his subordinate Frank Fitzsimmons as vice president. Frank wasn't too fond of Fitz, finding him unwise, but Jimmy reassured him that while Fitz wasn't a genius, he wasn't the type to stab him in the back. Instead, Jimmy warned that the one to watch out for was the little guy. Tony Provenzano, the New York Mafia captain who was nicknamed the Little Guy, led Teamsters Local 560. Though he and Jimmy Hoffa had grown close over the years, as the union grew in power, Tony turned to extortion, threatening trucking companies and intimidating people, typical thug behavior. When one of his subordinates started gaining too much influence, Tony ordered another of his men, Sally Bugs, to strangle him. In a ruthless act, they fed the body through a wood chipper, showcasing Tony's brutal nature. Because of this, Jimmy considered the little guy a thug who tarnished the union's reputation, and he wanted to run Frank, also a mafia member, for president of Local 326. Once Frank became president, he helped ensure that union members stayed loyal and true to their commitments. Meanwhile, during a long legal battle, someone approached Jimmy and fired a gun. Luckily, it turned out to be an air gun, and Jimmy wasn't hurt, but it seemed like a staged show. In his fight to retain his position as president, Jimmy deployed his legal team to investigate witnesses and jurors, bribing them to tilt the legal proceedings in his favor. Then, something completely unexpected happened. It was none other than the assassination of President JFK. Everyone present was utterly shocked. As a result of this event, Robert Kennedy stepped down from his position as Attorney General, and the pressure on Jimmy ceased. However, when Jimmy saw that the Union Building's flag was only half-mast during the national mourning period, he raised it to full mast, refusing to honor the president. This act led to Jimmy being charged with contempt, and on top of that, evidence of him bribing jurors came to light. Ultimately, he was sentenced to prison. While Jimmy was in prison, he issued orders to Fitz through Bill and Allen. However, Fitz began to follow the mafia's wishes rather than Jimmy's, recklessly lending out the union's pension fund money. Everyone except Jimmy was happy with the situation, but the problem arose when Allen, unable to tolerate it anymore, put a hold on the loans. In response, Russell instructed Frank to carry out a little retaliation. After receiving serious threats, Allen eventually caved and started following the mafia's orders. Meanwhile, Tony the little guy was embezzling union money and eventually got caught by the FBI. When Tony met Jimmy in prison, he asked for advice on how to get his money back, since Jimmy's funds hadn't been seized. However, Jimmy brushed him off, pointing out that he was in for fraud while Tony was in for embezzlement, dismissing him as a thug by saying, "You people." Enraged, Tony landed the first punch on Jimmy. Outside, Russell told Frank about a man named Joe Gallo. Not long ago, Joe had mocked Russell for joining the Italian-American Civil Rights League, sarcastically asking if he believed in that nonsense. Crazy Joe, as he was known, was a captain in the Colombo family. He had a habit of standing out by mingling with celebrities and getting his name in the papers. He even took it further by hiring recently released black men to kidnap his boss, all to avoid getting caught, acting completely on his own terms. Eventually, he even assassinated the leader of the Italian-American Civil Rights League. This enraged Russell, who wanted to deal with this piece of human trash. Frank selected a .32 caliber pistol, which would make just the right amount of noise. On his 47th birthday, Joe planned to have dinner in Little Italy, a neutral zone between the mafias, with his family. But what awaited him wasn't a celebration. It was a hail of bullets. The news of Joe being ruthlessly murdered in front of his family eventually reached Peggy. She quickly realized that it was her father's doing. 4 years later, in 1971, after Nixon became president, Jimmy, who had supported his election, was granted a special pardon on the condition that he would no longer be involved with the Teamsters. Despite this, Jimmy couldn't let go of his union and wanted to reclaim his position as president. However, Fitz also ran for president, and since the mafia preferred the more obedient Fitz, Jimmy needed the support of Tony the little guy from Local 520 to become president again. Reluctantly, but persuaded by Frank, Jimmy traveled to Florida to meet with Tony. However, the little guy didn't show up on time and arrived dressed inappropriately for the meeting. Already upset, Jimmy got straight to the point, but Tony demanded an apology for the "you people" remark Jimmy had made while they were in prison. In response, Jimmy insisted that Tony should first apologize for being late, and the tension began to rise. Frank and Tony Jack tried to mediate the situation, but things escalated quickly. Jimmy started hurling curses at the little guy, and little guy retaliated by insulting Jimmy's granddaughter. The conflict soon spiraled into a physical confrontation. Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno tried to calm the situation, dismissing the little guy as just a rookie, but Jimmy was furious, demanding that he be dealt with. Ultimately, Jimmy didn't get the support of the little guy and lost the union president position to Fitz. In response, Jimmy began publicly insulting Fitz. Fitz and the little guy then sent a message to Dave Johnson, one of Jimmy's closest allies, and in retaliation, Jimmy sent his own message to Fitz's son, who had taken over Dave's local. When Fitz fired Jimmy's wife, it infuriated Jimmy even more, leading him to openly criticize the mafia, though Russell and Frank stood by Jimmy. Fat Tony felt deeply betrayed and, through Frank, sent a message to Jimmy, urging him to retire. Despite this, Jimmy remained resolute. Meanwhile, Frank asked Jimmy to be the keynote speaker at a union testimonial dinner held in Frank's honor. At Frank's testimonial dinner, notable guests included the president of the NAACP, the district attorney, the mayor of Philadelphia, and, of course, Jimmy Hoffa as one of the speakers. The host jokingly remarked that even the FBI might be present. During the event, Fat Tony informed Russell that Jimmy was blocking loans for mafia business and had even vowed to recall previous loans if he regained the union presidency. Jimmy, defiant, insisted that all of this was simply because the union was his and that he had no intention of stepping down before his death. Despite still holding some affection for Jimmy, Russell passed along a warning from the higher-ups in the mafia, calling Jimmy ungrateful. But Jimmy, unwavering, fired back, saying that he had kept quiet for 5 years in prison, never giving up a name, and if they had a problem with him, they could get lost. He boldly declared, "No one can threaten Hoffa." At the ceremony, Jimmy presented Frank with a gold watch as a token of their bond, calling Frank his man. Russell also gave Frank one of the only 3 mafia rings in existence, signifying his acceptance into the inner circle of the mafia. Russell then added a chilling note: if the mafia higher-ups don't like someone, they could even remove a president, implying that there wasn't much more he could do for Jimmy. Frank delivered the message to Jimmy saying, "It's what it is," trying one last time to persuade him to back down. But Jimmy, defiant as ever, dismissed the warning, claiming the mafia didn't have the guts to act against him. He confidently said he had enough evidence to put them all in prison, adding that he had no intention of hurting Russell, and warned Frank, his man, to be careful as well. Fast forward to 1975, the story shifts to Russell, Frank, and their wives on a journey. While the trip initially seemed like it was for Russell's niece's wedding, the true purpose of their journey was to deal with the Jimmy situation. Frank had arranged a meeting between Jimmy and the little guy in an attempt to resolve their long-standing feud. However, during a brief stop at a hotel, Russell hinted that they had done everything they could for Jimmy, subtly implying that it was time to eliminate him. Frank, troubled by this, lay awake that night, torn over whether he should warn Jimmy. The next morning, Russell quietly pressured Frank to make sure the matter was dealt with, leaving Frank feeling deeply melancholy as the situation had spiraled beyond his control. In the end, Frank boarded a small private plane, alone, and flew to Detroit, where the final act was set to unfold. Upon arriving in Detroit, Frank, familiar with the routine, got into a waiting car, checked the gun, and set off on his mission. On the way to the meeting point with Tony, the little guy pro's associate, Sally Bugs, Frank spotted Jimmy waiting at the decoy location that had been set up to mislead him. Poor Jimmy. At the meetup point, Sally was prepping things with a few mafia underlings waiting nearby. Soon, Jimmy's stepson, Chucky, arrived in a car, ready to escort them to the meeting. Sally tried to get into the back seat, but he noticed the seat was wet. Chucky explained that it happened while he was delivering frozen fish for a friend. Sally, undeterred, offered to sit in the messy seat. However, a particular moment flashed in Frank's mind, prompting him to insist, with a firm tone, that he would take the back seat instead. As they drove, Sally asked Chucky what kind of fish it was. Chucky, agitated, brushed off the question, saying it didn't matter. He fumbled for an answer, and eventually said he was simply delivering something a friend had ordered. This scene subtly hinted at Chucky's involvement in the real-life Jimmy Hoffa case, cleverly using Sally's meticulous personality to build suspicion. In the real case, Chucky claimed the pink liquid found in the backseat was due to delivering frozen fish. However, the authorities, who had preserved the hair found in the car at the time of the incident, conducted DNA testing decades later in the early 2000s. The results revealed that the hair belonged to Jimmy Hoffa, linking Chucky to Hoffa's infamous disappearance. Anyway, when they finally met Jimmy at the fake meeting location, he was, as expected, furious about the delay. Sally tried to calm him by saying, "The little guy and Russ are waiting for you at the house." Even though Jimmy was still suspicious when he saw Frank sitting in the backseat, he couldn't easily shake off the doubts. However, his trust in Frank won out, and he got into the car. On the way to the house, Sally mentioned that he had cleared out the fish. Jimmy, still tense, snapped at him, asking, "What do you know about fish?" He then advised Chucky, telling him never to transport unsealed fish in the car because the smell would never go away. He added, "Remember that. It'll help you in life." This is a clever nod to Chucky's earlier fish story, showing the director's subtle humor. Despite his growing suspicion, particularly about what the little guy might be up to, Jimmy still felt somewhat reassured by Frank's presence. He even asked Frank if he had a gun with him. When they finally arrived at the house, the moment Jimmy realized something was terribly wrong, it was too late. Frank, the man Jimmy trusted most, shot and killed him in a brutal and final betrayal. After completing the mission, Frank rejoined Russell, and they attended the wedding of Russell's niece, the original cover for their trip. Meanwhile, Jimmy, who had once been one of the most powerful men in America, second only to the president, met a tragic and empty end, becoming nothing more than a handful of ashes. Not long after, news of Jimmy's disappearance spread nationwide. Peggy, noticing her father's lack of concern about Jimmy's whereabouts, instinctively knew that Frank had killed him. Frank made a phone call to Jimmy's wife, Jo, lying to her, saying that they would find Jimmy. In the following days, those close to Jimmy were summoned and interrogated, but no one spoke a word about the incident, leaving the case unsolved. One day, however, Sally Bugs was seen entering a federal building without saying a word to anyone. This led to his demise, as Frank was ordered to take care of him. Ironically, it was later revealed that Sally had already talked, but the person responsible for passing on the information forgot to deliver it. In the end, Sally was just unlucky. Frank also expressed regret over Chucky's 10-month sentence related to speculation about the car. Frank truly believed that Chucky had no involvement in Jimmy's disappearance. As for Fat Tony, he was eventually arrested on charges related to tax evasion, and not long after, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. Russell ordered a hit on a debtor who wasn't paying off his debt, assigning the job to Weasel, a mafia associate. However, Weasel turned out to be an informant for the police, which led to Russell's arrest. Frank himself wasn't spared either. He was charged with various offenses, including involvement in a building explosion and accepting a car as a bribe, leading to his own imprisonment. In their later years, the once powerful mafia figures saw their lives unravel in prison. Russell suffered a stroke, Fat Tony lost control of his bladder, and Frank developed arthritis. These men, who had once ruled parts of America, were now fading away in their cells. One day, while sharing bread like the old times, Russell tried to justify their actions, telling Frank that if they hadn't killed Jimmy, they would have been the ones to die. It was his way of lessening the weight of guilt. Soon after, Russell, not to be mocked, started attending church services inside the prison. A little while later, he passed away. Frank was released in October of that year, but by December, his wife, Irene, passed away from lung cancer. Left completely alone, Frank tried reaching out to his daughter Peggy. However, when she saw him, she immediately walked away without saying a word. Frank then met his other daughters, offering belated apologies, but one of them explained that they had been too scared to talk to him, worried he might do something terrible, no matter how much they struggled with the pain. Frank, now left to prepare his own funeral, is asked by the undertaker, "Is it for a man or a woman?" To which Frank replies, "For me." The undertaker, taken aback, simply responds, "Shit." Perhaps like the German soldiers Frank once thought were foolish, those who dug their graves thinking they could survive, he had been digging his own grave throughout his life, believing he might find redemption in the end. Even as the FBI came to him, telling him that everyone involved was now dead, but Jimmy Hoffa's family still lived and deserved to know the truth, Frank kept silent, refusing to give them any answers. A priest later asked Frank if he had any regrets or remorse, but instead of confessing the truth, Frank offered a hollow repentance, concealing his guilt. This took place in the same nursing home where Frank began telling his story at the start of the film. He shows a young nurse an old photo, but she has no idea who Jimmy Hoffa is. The passage of time is evident, and Frank briefly chats with her, though she shows no interest in his personal history. The scene shifts to what seems to be Christmas time. As Frank prays with the priest says he won't be able to return for the holiday. As the priest prepares to leave, Frank asks him not to close the door. The movie ends with the image of Frank, sitting alone, staring at the half-open door, as though he is waiting for someone, perhaps still hoping for something that will never come. Martin Scorsese's The Irishman starkly contrasts his previous mafia films, which at times felt glamorous and entertaining, by illustrating just how bleak and grim the end of a mafia life truly is. One of the most striking scenes for me was when the German soldiers were digging their own graves, a moment that, to me, symbolizes Frank's entire life. It serves as a reminder that while we may hide our sins from the world, we can never hide from ourselves. If one doesn't genuinely repent for their wrongdoings, it's akin to spending a lifetime digging one's own grave, at least for those who still hold on to some shred of conscience. Are you someone who lives without sin and can face yourself without guilt? Thank you for watching.